showed me for this year, which I shared at our New Year's conference, he was going to raise up people today who were going to confront heresies and false doctrines. I mean, when I got that word, if you were here at the New Year conference, I said, well, if the Lord's given that kind of word, then we better start expecting some major heresies to arise. And I had no clue they were going to be as bizarre as the ones that have manifested. Ones
The devil is only afraid of Christians trying to fly in prayer, who've got a bit of life in them. He's not worried about religion, he's not worried about prayers. But Christians who are really trying to pray in the name of Jesus, that gets him really worried. And therefore, he attacks at that point. As the little jingle puts it, Satan trembles when he sees the weakest saint upon his knees. Don't underestimate the devil and don't treat him as a joke. But he does tremble when he sees the weakest saint upon his knees. I believe that when you come to know the Lord, you come to know the devil at the same time. And if someone says to me, well, I don't have any experience of the devil, I've never come across the devil, I honestly wonder how far they've gone with the Lord.
In this, and there's going to be a lot more information to follow. But I wanted to give you an idea of what I'm seeing here, the red flags that it's brought up, and what I'm trying to convey to you. The information is there, and I didn't think this was all that serious a thing. This guy, maybe he was getting talked to, but maybe not. No, I think there's a conspiracy behind this. I think they actually have chosen Mark Taylor and pushed him up front, and he's getting guidance from powers that be. And he might honestly believe that he's doing the Lord's will, as a lot of prophets do. Or false prophets. They think God is speaking to them, but personally I think it's familiar spirits, because that's exactly where false prophets come from. It's not God talking to them, it's familiar spirits. An angel of light, Satan, comes to them. And that's the same thing that happened with Muhammad too. He thought an angel came and talked to him, and it wasn't an angel. It was the angel of light. And then he took it to his wife. He was scared to death. And she was a Catholic, and she convinced him that it was either Michael or Gabriel, one or the other, that came to him. So this is the same sort of thing here going on that was going on back there with Muhammad when he took over and created Islam in 625, something like that. You have to be very, very careful with this.
For the exact wordage or verbiage or translation of what happened in the garden, you're doing better to go look at the Targum, because the Targum is what the rabbinical teachers used to teach everybody as they sat down. They read from the Targum in Aramaic. Now, the King James Bible has evolved from that. It's not the other way around. So I want to read to you now the same thing from Genesis 4 in this King James Bible. It says, "And Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived, and bare Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord, and again bare his brother Abel." Okay, so in these very few sentences, it says, once again, "And Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived, and bare Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord, and she again bare his brother Abel." It doesn't say she conceived again. They were twins. Now, when you go to the Targum, and you just go do a little homework, "And Adam knew Hava, his wife, who had desired the angel. Now this is the serpent we're talking about. And she conceived and bare Cain. And she said, I have acquired a man, the angel of the Lord. And she added to bear from her husband Adam his twin, even Habel, Habel.
Welcome to Fringe Pop 321, the show that believes the world is stranger than we think, but thinking should not be strange. Now, odds are pretty high that all of you have heard of Adam and Eve. You may also have heard of their first two sons, Cain and Abel. Genesis 4, the first two verses, is pretty clear about this. It reads as follows, Now Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. And again, she bore his brother Abel. Now let's think about those two verses just for a moment. Adam knew Eve, his wife. To know a woman in biblical language is to have sexual relations. The word know is sort of a euphemism for sex in the Old Testament. So Adam knows Eve, she conceives, and bears Cain. Sounds pretty simple and straightforward. Cain, of course, was the first person murdered in the biblical story of the early earth. He killed his brother Abel, so things didn't go too well. And you would think, this is a pretty straightforward accounting. Adam and Eve have two kids, they're boys, Cain and Abel, and again, things go bad. But of course, when it comes to the wacky world of fringe Bible beliefs on the internet, nothing this straightforward can actually be this easy. Believe it or not, there are some who believe that Adam was not Cain's father, but instead Cain was fathered by the serpent in the Garden of Eden, Satan. And they even use the verses I just read to prove that idea. Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, I didn't hear Satan in the verse. Where does Satan come in? How in the world do we get this idea? Well, stay tuned. Now, where do folks get this idea that Cain was not fathered by Adam, but instead was fathered by the serpent in Eden? The idea is called the serpent seed theory, and it's popular with certain anti-Semitic groups. There are basically three trajectories to constructing the idea. First, it has to be established that Cain's father was not the man Adam, but was instead a divine being. Now, there's a grammatical ambiguity in the Hebrew text of Genesis 4:1 that's used to argue this point. Take a look at this picture of the Hebrew text of Genesis 4:1 with English translation. You'll notice that there's a small two-letter word in a red box. The two letters are Aleph and Tav, and the Hebrew word here is et. Now, this little two-letter word can be understood in one of two ways. First, it can be viewed as a particle. It's called the accusative marker by Hebrew grammarians, and it marks the direct object of a verb. Now, the English translator in our sample took the word that way. The particle marks the direct object of two verbs, conceived and gave birth. It therefore identifies Cain as the child who was conceived in Eve and to whom she gave birth. Cain is the direct object of those verbs. Consequently, the marker receives no translation in our example. Now, the same two-letter word appears later in the verse in the green box. An alternative option is that the two-letter word could be a preposition that means with, as in accompaniment, she went with me, or assistance, I completed the task with a computer. The interpretive issue for our consideration is whether the two-letter word in Genesis 4:1 in the green box is an object marker like the first one, or this preposition. If what we see here is a preposition, the verse would read, I have conceived and given birth to a man with the Lord. The word Lord there is the divine name Yahweh. Now, serpent seed theorists use this alternative to separate Cain from Adam in terms of parentage. They know that Yahweh was not Satan, of course, so the goal of this argument is simply to plant the suggestion that Adam was not Cain's father because Eve got him with the Lord, or with the help of the Lord, a divine being. So to get his father as Satan, to move beyond this first argument, requires a few different things. There are two other arguments to this. So after planting the suggestion that Adam was not Cain's father, that maybe Eve got him through a divine being, the serpent seed theorists moved to a second trajectory. The content of what an ancient Targum, and a Targum is an Aramaic translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, what that Aramaic translation says in Genesis 4:1. Now, the Targum I'm talking about specifically is Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, which says this, Adam knew his wife Eve, who had conceived from Samael, the angel of the Lord. This Aramaic translation adds an interesting note to this in the next verse. Then from Adam, her husband, she bore his twin sister and Abel. The ancient Targum clearly adds details not found in the Hebrew Old Testament that underlie our modern English translations. Cain's father is said to be Samael, the angel of the Lord. Now, this translation in the Aramaic Targum has no basis in any Hebrew manuscript of Genesis. It's entirely contrived. It's made up. Unless the reader wonder who Samael is, the same Targum identified him earlier in Genesis 3:6, the account of Eve's temptation by the serpent, Satan. Now, look at verses 4 and 5 in this Targum. We read this. At that moment the serpent spoke slander against his creator and said to the woman, "You shall not die, but every craftsman hates his fellow craftsman. For it is manifest before the Lord that on the day on which you eat of it, you shall be like the great angels who are able to distinguish good from evil." And the woman saw Samael, the angel of death, and she was afraid. To our eye, this Samael figure could be understood as a figure in the garden distinct from the serpent. But serpent seed theorists don't look at it that way. They want Samael to be the serpent. When Eve saw Samael, the angel of death, we are told that she's looking at the serpent who is speaking to her. And it's at this point that serpent seed believers are going to argue that, well, in Genesis 4, Eve conceived Cain with Samael. And if Samael is Satan, the serpent, in Genesis 3, there you go. You have Cain being fathered by the serpent. Now, beyond that, serpent seed theorists add another thought. They go to Genesis 5:3 from the same Aramaic Targum to bolster their notion to this point, which reads this: When Adam had lived 130 years, he begot Seth, who resembled his image and likeness. For before that, Eve had borne Cain, who was not from him and who did not resemble him. Now, this wording denies that Cain was from Adam. Cain was not from him and did not resemble him. The father of Seth was Adam, who resembled his father, but that wasn't true about Cain. Now, modern English translations based on the Hebrew text of the Old Testament, not Aramaic, in Genesis 5:3, believe it or not, appear to convey a similar idea with a different wording. It reads as follows: When Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness, after his image, and named him Seth. Now, even though there's no editorial comment about Cain not being like Adam, we don't get any information in Genesis 5:3 about Cain, and so we have an argument from omission. The point is that in Genesis 5:3, Seth is described as being in Adam's own lineage and likeness, but back in Genesis 4:1, Cain was not described that way.
Numbers, and they're going to glory in the fact that they're so contemporary. They're going to glory in their acceptance by the world. Jesus warned, beware of false prophets which come to you in sheep's clothing. They're to come like gentle sheep, sincere, intelligent, bright, but said inward they're ravening wolves. And folks, Jesus gave that in the context of his message. He said, because straight is the gate, narrow is the way, which leadeth to life, and few there be that find it. And the very next verse he says, beware of false prophets. You're going to come in sheep's clothing, but they're ravening wolves. It's Christ himself warning us. False prophets, false pastors, false evangelists, posing as submissive sheep, going to come saying the way is not that narrow. The way is not that straight. And they're going to accommodate. They're going to change the gospel to suit the needs of the people.